I think somehow suffering can't be the goal or the essence of creation. Like that'd be pretty horrible, wouldn't it? Like I think if creation has a goal or a purpose, then it is having meaningful lives and love and interconnection and meaningful conversation and the sort of beautiful things that we have. If there is any purpose at all, then I think that's the purpose.
Welcome to Closer to Truth. Today's chat is special. I'm speaking with two Closer to Truth contributors, two good friends, who are making intellectual journeys, spiritual journeys in what seems to be opposite directions. One away from Christianity, the other toward a form of it. Happily, they too are friends. Welcome, Helen De Cruz. Welcome, Philip Goff.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited about this conversation.
Hi, Robert. Hi, Helen. I'm really, really looking forward to this chat. Happy to be here.
Great. Helen, you're a philosopher of religion and a philosopher of mind. You write on your wonderful blog, Wondering Freely, which I recommend to everyone. As long as I can remember, I've been a Christian. I have written over 30 papers and 3 books in Christian philosophy. One fine Sunday morning, I realized I could not do it anymore. Why?
Well, basically, maybe it is American Christian nationalism that sort of did it in. But next to that, I also have theological problems that I've been basically wrestling with in these many papers and books in Christian philosophy that I've written. So I'm very eager to get into that in more detail in a moment.
Good. But your quest continues. It's not like you're dropping the importance of religion, right?
Oh no, no. I find religion is just the way that so many people engage with the important questions in life. And so for me, it is also a way to do so. So I continue to wrestle with a lot of questions that Christian philosophers also wrestle with, and that actually people all over the world are stumped by.
Great. Philip, you are a philosopher of mind known for defending panpsychism, as in your terrific book, Galileo's Era. In an Aeon essay, you write, I rejected Christianity at the age of 14. After years of debate and contemplation, I've come to think a heretical form of Christianity might be true. Shocking. Why?
Yeah, it's something that's a bit of a surprise to me, actually. But I suppose for a while now, I've been exploring the middle ground between traditional theism and traditional atheism, thinking both sides of this perennial debate get something right and something wrong. And I guess I came across a form of, maybe slightly unusual form of Christianity, closer to the spirit of the Eastern Orthodox Church, that spiritually resonates with me and seems to fit with these middle ground options I've been taking very seriously. So it's a surprise to me, but that's where I've ended up.
Good. Well, we'll see if you ultimately end up there. You go from basically a fictionalist Christianity, where Christianity is sort of a culture but not no truth value to it, to heretical Christianity. We're going to discuss that in depth. Most Christian theologians today would applaud your improvement, but I think they'd still give you a failing grade.
Right, yeah. So yeah, for many years I've been attending church, as you say, as a fictionalist, taking it as a beautiful, profound metaphor. So much I love about the symbolism of Christianity, turning worldly values upside down. But more recently, I've come to this, as you say, slightly unusual form that I'm taking seriously as something that actually might be true. I'm still very uncertain about it all, but I don't think faith is about certainty. I think it's about being confident enough to trust, and that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Uncertainty, passionate uncertainty, is the foundation of Closer to Truth. So the three of us are all united in that. So let me give a proper bio for each of you, very distinguished in your own areas, and then we'll really get into it in depth. Helen De Cruz holds the Danford Chair in the Humanities at St. Louis University. She has 2 PhD degrees, her first in archaeology and art sciences, and her second in philosophy. Her latest book is Wonderstruck, how wonder and awe shape the way we think. And everyone can see those, the chat we had on that very extensively on Closer to Truth. Philip Goff is professor of philosophy at Durham University. His provocative new book is Why, the Purpose of the Universe, in which he seeks to work out the ultimate nature of reality. Philip is known for defending panpsychism, and he co-hosts the Mind Chat podcast. And there you can also see an extensive discussion with Philip on Close to the Truth on his book, Why. Okay, guys, let's get into it in real detail, as two philosophers would. Helen, you write that I found my theistic picture cobbled together from my Christian, which is Catholic, upbringing and more deliberating philosophical reflections wasn't really working for me anymore. So, what has been your intellectual, spiritual journey, the process, and what is the core driver of your moving to reject Christianity?
So I think it's an important piece of background information about me that I've always been quite a religious person. And even as a kid, I was actually one of those, I think, insufferable kids who was part of the parish youth group of my local Catholic church. And another thing to note is that my father is Malaysian. Malaysia is not is a Muslim majority country, but he is Catholic, and so he has long instilled to me the idea that it's a choice. Christianity is an identity, and like there's lots of Christians who say they're being persecuted, but honestly, if you're in a Muslim majority country, like you're not being persecuted, but it's still tough. So my family has endured all sorts of things there. For example, if you marry a Muslim, then your kids have to also be Muslim, and you also have to convert. If the Muslim converts, then you are liable to all sorts of penalties, including being thrown in jail. So that always stuck with me, and I was proud of my Christian identity. I did Sunday school. I did all sorts of things. In my 20s, I then got more and more problems with Catholicism. Like, not so much like I love Catholicism. I love a lot of aspects of it. But one thing I didn't enjoy was the sort of idea about women not being fully equal members. And so that's how I then moved to Anglicanism. They had just, and that's, by the way, the Church of England. So that's the church Philip belongs to, if I'm not mistaken. And they had just, they just started ordaining women in my teens. So there was actually a girl who was Anglican, who was part of my church group. And she said, I'm a little bit of a feminist. And I thought, like, what does that mean? Like, it's the first time I heard that word, feminist. I was 16. And she said, like, yeah, I think women and men are equal. And so that's how I then went towards Anglicanism. And I was there for the longest time. I moved to England. I was part of the choir, and I did all sorts of like local things in the church community. But I got more and more sort of theological doubts. And I thought, well, it's not a problem. Like every religion, you will feel tensions. It's not a problem. So it's hard to say exactly what the breaking point is, but things like I had difficulties believing any sort of resurrection story that I found plausible. And the story just perplexes me. It perplexes me the way that, like, the early disciples, interestingly, like, they don't know what to make of it, and I still don't know what to make of it. Like, many people draw strength from it, but I I just find it perplexing. And then the atonement and the idea of grace, and then the idea that basically God has to suffer or has to give His own Son up to suffer for us. Is very, very difficult. So I think eventually what I landed on is a kind of panentheistic theism that was promoted by the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Schleiermacher. And I have several papers on that. Schleiermacher, I think, really explains religion as this kind of feeling. which I think is very interesting. So he was one of the first. Later, you had other people like Otto and even William James, but he was very early in that. And for a while, I thought, yeah, this is really working. Schleiermacher has a non-fall account where it isn't the case that humans fell. And so, but basically, where God creates the conditions, thus that it's inevitably that we fall into sin. But eventually, that didn't work for me either anymore. And at some point, like, I don't know if it was living in the US, we can go more into it. But I just thought, like, I can't do it anymore. And that's still the best description I can give. So,
Good. Well, we'll get into it. Philip, let's get to your journey. What has been the process of your what I call intellectual spiritual journey? And as with Helen, what is the core driver, if you would look at one core aspect of your moving to take seriously what you now call a heretical form of Christianity?
Yeah, that was so fascinating to hear Helen's story, and I'm just thinking already so many similarities and differences. I think more similarities, to be honest. I mean, I was also raised Catholic, practicing Catholic in a very vibrant church in Liverpool. Um, I wouldn't say I was strongly religious. In fact, I upset my grandmother by refusing to get confirmed when I was 14, and my mother sent me to speak to the youthful priest. We went for a drive. He tried Pascal's wager on me. I can't remember what I said now, but anyway, at the end of the drive, he said, I don't think you should get confirmed. You've thought about it. And I don't think my mother was too happy about that. But anyway, but I would say I've always been a spiritual person. I think Helen and I have that in common. I had a sense that there is a greater reality at the core of things. But I decided because of the problem of suffering, I guess I didn't believe in God. Also have deep concerns about women priests not being part of the Catholic Church and priests not being able to marry, I think can cause a lot of harm. I've seen that happen very, very badly, actually, in some cases. Sexuality, contraception, and the Catholic Church, I suppose. I kind of think, humans always go for hierarchy and power structures. And I think like the Catholic Church is what you'd expect humans to set up, so that kind of makes me a bit suspicious of it. So I left institutional religion from the age of 14. I guess I was spiritual, but not religious. And then it was just in my early 30s, living in Liverpool again, actually, by chance, my first permanent job was in the University of Liverpool, and started to feel, I guess, the need for those community aspects that I valued in my childhood. I think religion does perform a very important social role of bringing the community together, marking the seasons and the rites of passage in a way the secular world has found difficult to replicate. So I found myself returning to the Church of England this time, which is very similar to the Catholic Church in form, but it's maybe a little bit more flexible. It was set up because the king wanted a divorce. I'm currently watching the wonderful Wolf Hall series on BBC on the great books, and I think that gives it a less ideology, right? It wasn't brought into existence with great ideology behind it. So I find it sort of kind of like the Catholic structure, but a lot more flexible. People, if it's a broad church, there are very conservative wings, but your average Anglican church, they're not gonna sort of pin you down on what your beliefs are. Have you got the correct beliefs? And I go to church with a professor from our physics department who doesn't really believe anything at all, really, apart from a sense of a spiritual underpinning. So that was my spiritual practice in the Church of England for a long time. And then just recently, I guess for intellectual reasons, I found myself open to this less standard but more realist conception of Christianity, and it was seeing just really seeing to get to the intellectual bit of it. I suppose it was seeing the case for atheism. I've always, as long as I can remember, thought there can't be the very traditional God because of suffering, but also there's things on the other side that the atheist struggles to explain, particularly the fine tuning of physics for life, and there are hypotheses in the middle, such as a God of limited powers, that I think can accommodate both of these. And then I wrote the Why book, and it was only after that, talking to many different Christian thinkers, reading different Christians, and learning about this more Eastern Orthodox conception where there's less of a focus on sin. I also don't like that, as Helen said. God's not interested in finding someone to punish for our sins. I've always found that view intellectually bizarre, and also spiritually doesn't resonate. Whereas the Eastern Orthodox view that it's all about God wanting to unify with creation, God becoming more like us so we can become more like God. And I began to think, well, intellectually, I think we could maybe talk about that, perhaps, or perhaps not. It fits very
Yeah.
well with this God of limited powers stuff that I think is well evidenced. And also, it just really spiritually resonates in a way I thought Christianity couldn't resonate. And
Good, Philip.
so,
In the book, Why, The Purpose of the Universe, you argue both against, as you've said, theism and against atheism, and you argue for a cosmopsychism, where the universe as a whole is the source of the nature of consciousness that pervades the universe. And so I went back when preparing for this in the book, and I found 13 uses of the word Christianity, which includes the index, but not a one of them that I could find was it referring to a belief that you were considering. Now, the book was only published last November, so it's been barely more than a year. So has this been this sudden change occurred within that year? As I said, I find no evidence of it in your latest book, which is terrific, by the way.
okay, yeah, we can learn all the secrets now. Well, I think in the Why book, I considered a few different conceptions of God or something goddish. I did consider the cosmopsychist view you mentioned there, but I also considered non-standard conceptions of a more traditional idea of God, and the one I like best is this idea of a God of limited powers. So already in the book, I was attracted to that idea. But insofar as I talked about Christianity in the book, it was the fictionalist view. Has it been just this last year? To be honest, I think it's probably a little longer than that because, you know, by the time you submit a book, it's a
Yeah,
year till it's published.
right.
And I think for a good few years, maybe, I've been getting closer to this. But I like to just really make my mind up before I go public with something. Every day I'm as a monologue questioning myself and raising the best objections to my views that I can. So it's probably been a few years actually that I've been more in this heretical rather than fictionalist mode. But I wanted to really get it all ironed out before I put it in print. And so
Good.
yeah.
As you have new changes in the future, give us a heads up, and we'll Culture of Truth will be the place you can scoop it.
Will do. Thanks, Robert.
Okay, Helen, you've heard Philip's story. A lot of similarities that I hear with your quest, but obviously winding up in a different place. How did you react as you were listening to Philip?
I read Why. I wrote an endorsement for it. It's a wonderful book. So I'm acquainted with that. I'm acquainted with the Eon piece, and I found it really fascinating to hear more context. For example, I didn't know that Philip had been attending church already for a few years. I think that's interesting. Like there is something to that, as Philip is saying, that religion does very well. And I talk about it in Wonderstruck. Religion is very good at giving meaning and shaping are the the things that make our lives, the things that are continuously or inspiring, difficult to deal with, like death, birth. Religion is very good at sort of putting that in a context that I think, like what we often use the word holy for. Like there is something holy or sacred about these sorts of events. And I think, like, as to, I agree also with Philip that you have to be careful about like what sort of position. And one reason that I haven't like written more about this is that I don't know where I will land. I think one difference that maybe we can talk about a bit more later is that Philip is very into William James, and I am too. I love William James. I think he's a wonderful writer. And I think his idea that you have to sometimes, the evidence doesn't give you everything. Like you still have to, as an agent, make decisions. And sometimes something can become a life option to you. Like, for example, this heretical Christianity with a God of limited powers became a life option to him. But more and more, as I have been interested in William James and knew the paper for decades, I've only read the paper to which it responds, namely Clifford's Ethics of Belief, recently. And it's such a beautiful paper. Like everybody makes fun of this paper because the way that William James basically lampoons this paper, like, yeah, you always and everywhere have to have evidence to believe something. I forgot the exact formulation. But actually, it's a beautiful paper about that. If you, about serious matters, you really, really have to be cognizant, and you have to think very carefully and weigh your best evidence to come to a considered conclusion.
Philip, you've heard Helen's story. Again, many similarities, some differences, but she winds up in an opposite place where you are.
Yeah, well, I've also really enjoyed Helen's writing on this and listening to it on podcasts and so on. And yeah, I mean, well, maybe we could come to that issue of uncertainty. I mean, I didn't find anything I disagree with there. I suppose the way I think about it, ultimately, I do think of faith as about trust. It's about trusting a certain view on the meaning of existence, trusting it for how you understand your deepest experiences and to shape your life goals. And yet, you do want some evidence. We need, I suppose, I think of the intellectual bit as kind of like the gatekeeper, right? That you need to convince the gatekeeper before it's rationally acceptable to take this leap of faith. But, and I wonder whether or not Helen agrees with this, I don't think to open the gate, you certainly don't need total certainty. I'm sure Helen would agree with that. But I don't even think it needs to be more probable than not. I
Mm,
think it just needs to be a credible possibility. Maybe, I don't
mm,
know, 30%. I don't think you should trust, I don't know, Scientology, because I think that's too improbable. So there's certain things that are just too improbable. The gatekeeper won't let you take the leap of faith. But if something is 30% chance it's true, and you think it's gonna bring you happiness, give you a community, spiritual practice, a sense of deeper sense of meaning and purpose, then that's enough. So I think some people think when they're in, should I join a religion? Is it definitely true? Is it definitely true? I think that's too much. You should think, is there a reasonable chance it's true? And is it going to make me happy? That's what I think the test. What do you think?
So, Philip, your 30% number, not holding you to 30%, but well below 50%, really applies only in the area of religion. I mean, you're not applying that 30% rule to which apartment or house you would buy or what restaurant to go to, but rather because of this omni impact of religion on one's life, from community to belief systems, etc. Right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say it's more related to the fact that I say it as trust. So I actually think I've got a very conventional view of belief. I think for belief, I think you need at least 50% probability. I think of belief as pretty high confidence. But I don't think of faith as belief. Actually, Karen Armstrong, in her very interesting book, The Case for God, argues that the focus of belief is a sort of modern corruption. And actually, people used to think of faith more as trust or engagement or having your heart in something. But I think if we're talking about trust, then I think it's pretty standard that you less than 30% is okay. You might say, or, take the example, suppose, think about climate change. I think if you're just going on evidence, are we going to deal with climate change as a society? I think, well, probably not. Or, at least it's very uncertain. You shouldn't say, I believe we are. But you could say, well, I'm going to have faith that we are. I'm going to choose to trust that possibility, live in hope of it, because it's going to give me meaning and motivation and push me forwards. So I think and there's a lot of discussion in philosophy of religion, actually, whether we should understand faith as belief or something more like hope and trust. And I think if we go for hope or trust, then I think it makes sense that something non-negligible but less than 50% is adequate.
Interesting. You have four terms that we're playing around with: belief, faith, hope, and
Mm.
trust. And they're really quite different. The two that seem the closest to me are trust and faith, but they too are not the same. And faith seems to have maybe a lower standard, but a greater hope. Helen, can you help Philip and I in this confusion we have with these terms?
Oh my goodness. I don't know if I'm the right person to ask. I do think, and this is actually, I think, a pretty common view in analytic philosophy of religion, that your standards for hope can be a lot lower than for belief. So
Hmm.
typically for belief, the standard has to be well over 50%. Like if it's 51%, like honestly, are you for really important things that doesn't seem like a good idea. For example, did he do it? Did he murder this person
Hmm.
or something? Then 51 is not good. So there's a pragmatic aspect to this, obviously. I think, yeah, for hope it could be a lot lower. For example, my prognosis now, cancer prognosis, is not good. But, I'm not going to give up on myself. As long as there's clinical trials, there's hope. So I keep the hope. And faith is similar, I think, to hope. But in faith, like, yeah, here's a very interesting analysis of hope that I heard of C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis has this analysis of hope in Perelandra, which is one of the books. He has a trilogy that plays on Mars and on Venus and on Earth. It's a space trilogy, and in one of the books you have the main character who suddenly has real hope, and then he says it's not the hope, like I'm doggedly going on no matter what, but it is hope that is actually informed by a small hope of success.
Hmm.
And I thought, yeah, C.S. Lewis, you're totally right. These are two different forms of hope. Like, and like, if Christianity or if any religious belief is just the sort of dogged hope, like I'm going to cling to this, no matter what, like Kierkegaard maybe has this sort of, you pull yourself out of despair. I'm not a Kierkegaard scholar, but that's how I think he sees it. Then I think that's not good enough. But
Hmm.
if there is a reasonable idea that, yeah, this could well be true, even though it doesn't meet these standards of belief, then I think, yeah. So I see there that hope could have that role. Like it can't be the kind of hope that you just do to keep on going. It has to have something, I think, for religious belief.
Philip, can you distinguish between faith and trust?
Well, the way I'm thinking about this, and actually this is all incredibly helpful. I've got a grant for a project on faith next academic year. So
Mm.
I'm trying to get my thoughts together for this. But the way I'm thinking about it, I suppose, is I'm interested in the nature of faith. And is that the same as belief? Should we analyze it as belief, or maybe belief plus something else like positive behavior or something towards the faith? Um, or should we understand it as trust and hope? And I suppose I'm in the latter camp, maybe thinking of it as a combination of trust and hope. So part of faith, I think, part of what we get out of faith is living in hope that there's a greater purpose to existence and seeing what we do as contributing in some small way to that greater purpose. And I've found through that it's really lessened my ego, and actually it might sound it might sound paradoxical, but it's made me more rooted in the present moment, because it's made me less worried about my own personal success and failure. If I'm seeing the meaning of my life as part of some bigger purpose that's going on, I'm less bothered about how successful I am and more freed up to just enjoy friends and family in the present moment. So that's one aspect of it that I talked about a lot in my Why book, living in hope of a greater purpose. But then there's the trust aspect, and I suppose I think of that as about trusting this as a way of understanding your spiritual experiences. So, well, the first part is trusting your spiritual experiences, but then trusting a certain religious view about how to interpret them. So, I don't know, Hindu mystics might interpret their spiritual experiences revealing the divine at the core of their being, and then that might make them meditate, whereas Christians or Jews or Muslims might interpret their spiritual experiences as revealing a creator that loves them. So, and it's very uncertain, but you trust that way of understanding your experiences. So they're the two things I see of real value, at least those two things: living in hope of a greater purpose and giving you a structured way of understanding your spiritual experiences. And, you know, the uncertainty is annoying, but I don't think you're making an intellectual error if you're just aware that it's uncertain, right? You're making an intellectual error if you're like, no, I mean, it's totally certain it's true. You know, that glint in the eye you get both from fundamentalist religious people and militant atheists. They're definitely true. But if you're trusting and hoping and you're aware intellectually that it's very uncertain, then you're not making an intellectual error. Of course, it would be nice if it was more certain, but, you know, that's what we've got. And you either choose to say, well, it's not certain enough, I'm not going to take the risk, or you say, well, I'm going to take the risk and hope for the best.
Yeah, I've enjoyed recently asking the large language modules questions about Closer to Truth, specifically, why is Closer to Truth so bad? Or what are the big problems? Or why do people not like Closer to Truth? And
Oh,
and the answers I get resonate with what Philip just said, that it's that you're not taking strong positions, that no one knows what you believe by the end of what we're talking about. Of course, then it says at the bottom, but most people don't agree with all these criticisms, that most people like it. So that makes me feel better at the end. But that's been a critique that some people have. And it's obviously a critique on both sides. People who are atheists, when we deal with the nature of God or something like that, saying that, you know, we're being very vacillating. Well, I can't help it. I mean, this is the reality. This is the closest you'll be to truth. I mean, that's what we think. That's our opinion. So I'm very, I'm very sympathetic with that view, that as long as you know the uncertainty by which you are living, then it's okay to make these kinds of things. Look, it may seem that you guys are moving in opposite directions, gliding past each other, but I think you're actually a lot closer than it appears. And I think let's get into one specific, which is the nature of God, or about God. And I think the one thing that you both have in common is that you both take God seriously. Doesn't mean believe or not believe, but taking the issue seriously. So let's talk about God and God's traits. Helen, start with you. I want to quote something that you've written. You said that I was an agnostic about the properties of God, the nature of God, etc., but not about the existence of God. I was and still am, as you wrote on your blog, Wondering Freely. You're pretty sure that God exists because of the way the world appears to you at that point. but then your conception of what that God is began to shift. Again, you write, I felt I could no longer trust God was benevolent. You said, rather, especially after I considered the problem of evil in animals and other non humans, I slowly began to see God as a magnificent artist, a creator who takes enormous liberties for his creative ends. So please develop this thought, Helen. I think it's really important to your way of thinking. I could no longer trust God was benevolent.
Yeah. So my theism, basically, I'm a pretty skeptical sort of person. And early on, one of the things I considered when Catholicism wasn't working for me was a sort of Dawkinsian atheism. And in fact, I would go, I was a teenager and I went to this resort, which is like a spiritual retreat center in France called Thésée. And I had these books by Dawkins. I had The Selfish Gene, The Extended Phenotype, and The Blind Watchmaker. And while I was there on retreat and heard all these Christian stories and so on, in the evening with my lamp, I would be reading Dawkins. But the problem is that Dawkins doesn't quite work for me because one, I think that the way that our lives are just so numinous. There is such a sort of sense of the numinous that pervades everything. At least for me, that is hard to describe. And such a Dawkinsian view, even though it comes close to what I might want, because he does have awe at nature. He really does, but he doesn't have like any sort of way to frame it that I find satisfactory. So because of this numinous feeling and also some religious experiences I've had, I feel like somebody who has my kind of evidence could not but be a theist. Of course, like I understand that religious experience is subjective, and it's weird, like if you talk about it, like it's not that this is all of a sudden a shutdown argument. So I thought, yeah, God exists, but I didn't know what to think about God. And I've written a book, co-written a book in 2015, Natural History of Natural Theology, very critical of arguments that try to find like God as a moral being because of the moral sense within and that sort of thing. I think that all doesn't quite work. So I think actually that it's very difficult, right? I mean, this was something that I was thinking about as Philip was talking about, like, what is true? What do we know? Like, or when you were talking about the large language models and closer to truth, like, how do we know? Like, I think maybe the best way I heard it formulated was this Jewish friend of mine who said, imagine that I am at the pearly gates and I see Saint Peter, which is not a good sign. And then Saint Peter says, yeah, I'm sorry, but you know, Jesus and so forth. And then I stand there at those pearly gates and I said, oh, damn. And then I say, look, you didn't give me enough evidence. You didn't give me enough evidence not to be a Jew. You didn't. Like, and I think that's right for everybody. Like, it's just very complicated. And the fact that we experience life so differently and life experience is so important in shaping our religious views makes it very difficult to like see like what is a rational way or reasonable view to hold. And so eventually I came to this idea of God as this cruel artist. I had this for a while, but I kind of stopped having that view, which is good because it's a horrible view to hold. Like you'd rather have no God than God who thinks, "Oh, how beautiful! Let's have a beautiful war where people can really step up. Let's have the Holocaust so that people can be really courageous." And how beautiful is that, right? Isn't that narratively beautiful? Like I think it's horrific. So I'm glad I don't believe that anymore. But I thought, like, yeah, that's what the evidence dictates. Like the world is full of suffering, but it's certainly awesome. If God wanted to make narratively beautiful, awesome material, then that's what he would do. But I don't think that anymore now.
Philip, you too are distressed deeply by the problem of evil, but you come to a very different conclusion than God is great, but more interested in art than in goodness. You come up with the answer that God is good, but has limited abilities. So please develop this theme: a good God of limited abilities.
Yeah, well, I loved the story about reading Dawkins in Teze. I really love to go to Teze. I love the music of Teze. Actually, at my wedding and my younger daughter's baptism, we had some Teze music. It really resonates with me more than a lot of hymns. But yeah, and it's fascinating, Helen's idea of this God who it's sort of like Hannibal Lecter, maybe, isn't it? Sort of
Mm.
loves beauty, but doesn't care about is totally unempathetic. I mean, also, and I think we should be exploring these middle way options. Tim Mulgan, in his book Purpose in the Universe, I had him for a conference in Durham recently. He explores in that wonderful book the idea of a good God, but who doesn't care about us, right? We're just an unfortunate byproduct on the way to something better. We're just not important enough for God to care about us. He calls it ananthropic purposivism. But yeah, I mean, the view I've landed on, as you say, Robert, is a God who is good but had limited abilities. And I think if you just focused on fine tuning, there might be other motivations for thinking about God. But if you're focused on fine tuning, I think it's a very simple hypothesis to specify. What are the limitations of God? Well, if you take physics, take the numbers out, that gives you a certain kind of structure, and you say, well, God can only create from a singularity and can only create a universe with that structure, but can fiddle with the numbers. And so what we want from a plausible hypothesis is it's fairly simple and it explains the data. So I think this is it's simpler than physics. That's simple enough for me. And it can explain fine tuning in terms of God's purposes, God's perfect goodness, but can also explain suffering in terms of God's quite simple to specify limitations. So, I mean, I think this is at least a plausible option. And I'm not saying these other options are not also have some plausibility, but returning to our previous discussion, and I suppose this leads to kind of question I'd be interested to ask Helen. If you're thinking of, well, it's trust, and so it only needs to be a credible possibility, then there could be more than one option that's a credible possibility. So I guess I'm curious what Helen thinks of the kind of conception of Christianity I'm taking seriously. I'm choosing to trust it with the God of limited powers and this Eastern Orthodox idea of the atonement and the resurrection we haven't got onto, but a conception of the resurrection that involves visionary experiences for the early Christians rather than seeing and touching a body. I was very influenced by the biblical scholar Dale Allison on this. Whether this is a package that does Helen think is a credible possibility, or do you think it is? No, it's just it's ruled out. It's not credible enough. It's sort of 1% or less or something.
Helen, Philip is putting you on the spot, so I'm going to.
Ha,
We need to
yes.
get some disagreement going here. joking.
Well, I'm a conciliationist about religion. I wrote this book in 2019, Religious Disagreement, where I actually argue you should, precisely because our experiences are so different and everything is so uncertain. Like some people say, our experiences are so different and therefore you shouldn't listen to other people, right? Because there's just like no rational grounds for comparison. But I think, no, that's precisely why you should listen to other people. So I remember reading Philip's essay and I thought, like, yeah, if I see a knockdown argument here for Christianity or an option that I hadn't considered that is really attractive, then I might reconsider my position. And ultimately, I do think that it is a good life option. I really like the position. I like it. I think one of the reasons that I didn't like say right then, right there, okay, I've reconverted, like shortest deconversion ever, is that one thing I really love about sort of lots of theistic traditions is this idea that God is one. God is one. And I just don't know how a unique incarnation fits into that. So I could sort of see Jesus as a way that God instantiates in the world, but I like the idea that it sort of brings away from the oneness of God, and that's of course like ever since Christians and Muslims, for example, and Jews have been debating, that has been a major sticking point. And I find it quite interesting to fall onto like in medieval Europe, for example, in Spain, you had Muslims and Christians debating, and the Muslims would often say, yeah, what about the oneness of God? The Christians say, yeah, but our Trinitarianism somehow, but it does feel like less oneness see than say Islam, which has like a radical view of God as one. And so for me at least, it feels more like a life option because of the way that sort of reality presents itself to me. That there isn't a unique incarnation of God.
Philip, I want to push back a little bit about what you say, God, a God of limited powers, because if I'm thinking that there is a God, that if that's a possibility, as the ultimate ground of being, that there's nothing more fundamental than God, to have that God limited basically means a finite amount of power, and a finite number for something that is the foundation of all reality kind of disturbs me. It just doesn't fit, because where is that finite number? Is that the ultimate brute fact that God has a power of this level to begin with? Now, the evidence you use is that you say that God would have liked to have made intelligent life or human beings, whatever, in an instant, but couldn't do that. By the Genesis story, just breathing into dust, and there you have it. But God had to go through this long process of the fine tuning of the the Big Bang and the initial conditions and the evolution and that. But isn't it actually a more clever God that could create out of the primordial plasma at the first instant, and use gravity and electromagnetism, and of course the other forces, strong and weak, or whatever else there may be, working their magic over almost 14 billion years? Isn't that a cleverer God than sort of a magical God?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I guess there's two really interesting challenges to my view there from Robert about questioning the idea of a limited God, and then Helen focusing on the Trinity and whether that undermines the oneness of God. Um, yeah, on the limitations of God, I do get this pressed a lot on me by more traditional believers saying, well, what explains that? Is it something outside of God? God's supposed to be the ultimate explanation. But I think whatever you believe, you never quite get rid of the why questions.
Right.
Even if you have the very traditional idea of God, it's like, well, why does God exist rather than nothing, or rather than just the atheistic universe or
Mm.
whatever? So you've always got to, and I do. I think I've got a paper I just put on my website, a draft of a paper on this actually. Um, I guess I do ultimately think God is the ultimate explanation. If you fully understood the nature of God, you just say, oh my God, this thing has to exist and has to be the way it is. But I think that's beyond anything we can comprehend. So I think, yeah, if you understood the nature of God, you just understand why God has those limitations. But I think that's not too different, in my view, from what a more traditional theist would have to say, because I don't think we really understand why God has to exist. But just coming to the Trinity, I mean, this is actually something I've not, before I kind of went public with this, I hadn't really thought very much about the Trinity, surprisingly. And then there's all these traditional believers saying, do you believe in the Trinity? That's the sort of the test you've got to pass. And I definitely don't feel the need to have the totally orthodox view of the Trinity. I don't understand why non-Catholics, at least, or Protestants, feel the need to accept the Nicene Creed, feel the need to accept the view people had in 380 AD. Why do we have to think that? I mean, I understand if you're a Catholic and you think the church has sort of
Mm.
been guided to the truth, but if you reject that, then why do you think that? But I'm probably not too far from orthodoxy, and I don't see why we can't just think of it as a sort of part whole relationship. So God is one thing but has various aspects. So maybe there's the aspect of God that is immanent, present in the universe and in our hearts, what Christians have come to know as the Holy Spirit. There's maybe the aspect of God that is the unfathomable ultimate source of existence, and I would think of that as the Father. And then there's something on Christianity that kind of mediates what Christians call the Logos. Um, we translate as the Word, which Christians think was somehow embodied in Jesus. So it's something that sort of mediates between the ultimate source of existence and the part of God that's fully embedded in the world. So does that capture the oneness if it's still one unified God, but just has these aspects?
I love that, but you could then have even more aspects, of course. Like, why stop at three,
Yeah.
right? So
Oh
you
yeah.
have, like, in
That's fair.
Islam, you have like the 99 names of Allah, which are basically sort of like aspects of God. And you sort of pointed at something that has bothered me as well. There's this beautiful book by Hugh Nicholson called The Spirit of Contradiction in Christianity and Buddhism, I think it's called. And basically, what he argues is that the reason that we have these particular creeds with these particular formulations, like he proceeds from the Father and the Son. And as you know, in Eastern Orthodoxy, it's different. There, it's not that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son, but that you have the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, if I'm not mistaken. So they have a slightly different view. And you might think, who cares, right? I mean, we don't even remember. You ask the average Christian on the street, like, what is it? They're not even going to know. But at the time, this was like people would knife each other's down over this.
No, I mean I totally agree. I don't feel the need. I want to know what do we need to make sense of it? You know, for me, the core of it is God and the universe becoming closer together, God becoming more like us so we can become more like God. What do we need to believe in? And I do think you do sort of need these three aspects, however you understand that. But yeah, maybe there are more aspects that we don't know about. And um yeah, actually, I mean, William Lane Craig, who I don't agree with in so many ways, politically and in terms of his theology, doesn't spiritually resonate with me. But I think I was just reading a book on different views in the Trinity, and he was a contributor, and he kind of admitted, if I understood him correctly, that his view of the Trinity is a bit heretical because he thinks, why should I feel the need to agree with these councils? I'm not a Catholic. And he says, I stick to the Bible. I suppose I'm prepared to contradict both the councils and the Bible, but yeah, I think we should be thinking about what do we need to make spiritual sense of it, and um, yeah, let's not get too high. It's all very uncertain.
Philip, I liked your point about my critique about a God of limited powers being a finite number to deal with the ground of being. And your point is basically that no matter where you are, there's going to be some ultimate why question that you can't answer. So, if I'm upset that it's a finite number, the question of why God rather than nothing is a problem I might have. That would be the same kind of problem. So everybody's going to have the ultimate why question: why this rather than that, or why this rather than nothing?
Yeah, I do concede that the more traditional believer is maybe taking less as primitive and unexplained, that me adding these limitations is an extra thing. And that's a little bit of a cost to the theory. It makes the theory a little bit more complicated. But the problem with the more traditional view, in my humble opinion, is it can't account for the data of suffering. So I think, in line with standard scientific philosophical practice, it's better to have a slightly more complicated theory if it can better deal with the data.
So that's good. So here's what I hear. Um, the problem of evil is an enormous one. Everybody knows that, but it is really foundational to both Helen's move and Philip's move. in terms of the basic driver, the problem of evil. Just to state it very clearly, it's the tension between God being all powerful on one hand, able to do anything, and all good, everything that God does is beneficial on the other. And those are made incompatible, contradictory by the problem of evil. Now, to resolve the problem of evil, here's what I find fascinating. You guys kind of move in opposite directions in terms of where you're weakening this all-powerful, all-good tension. That Helen is weakening the all-good, at least in your initial version of God being the creative artist. You're weakening the all-good to make the problem of evil go away or make it less. And Philip is attacking the problem by weakening the all-power. So you both need to weaken the force of the problem of evil to deal with God, but the way you do it is you undermine one or the other different aspects of that dipole.
Yeah, I think one philosopher I admire is Holmes Rolston III, who says creation is cruciform. Like, so he takes the suffering of Jesus and the atonement, etc., as a sort of model for the whole of creation, because a lot of creation suffers. And one thing that made this move to me clear was that it's not just human beings, but animals that have been suffering like for millions of years. And as Philip says, like, maybe God couldn't do it otherwise. And that's surely a good motivation to create from scratch, right? You could create from scratch because you just um, you don't want all those creatures to go through all that suffering, but it does happen. So it seems like the very form of creation involves suffering. And I'm still perplexed by that. I wish that I could say, like Holmes Rolston, like, yeah, and that's Christianity also talks about suffering, and that's it. Because I think somehow suffering can't be the goal or the essence of creation. Like, that'd be pretty horrible, wouldn't it? Like, I think if creation has a goal or a purpose, then it is having meaningful lives and love and interconnection and meaningful conversation and the sort of beautiful things that we have. If there is any purpose at all, then I think that's the purpose. So that's what I'm struggling with right now. Like, how do I find that within a theistic framework? And I haven't gotten the answer fully worked out.
Philip?
We're pretty close, aren't we? I think there needs to be, if God is all about love, if the purpose of existence is all about love, why I can't make sense of that if God can do anything. Something has to give. And to say again, I think there could be multiple options. If this is not about certainty, there could be multiple options for resolving this dilemma. But yeah, I'm curious, Helen. So why do you think limiting God's power is no good for addressing this as just an option? I'm not trying to convert you. Clearly, say just you could think it's an option, but still. It's not something you personally want to go for, but why do you think it's not an option?
To me, God just feels like limitless and magnificent. So I don't know, like it is an extra thing that you introduce, right? A limited God. Like if you have the Anselm, the traditional one that everybody sort of doesn't like and that you use in philosophy, the original ontological argument, like, oh, let's see what's wrong with this argument. I do like that you get from this argument something that is limitless, that is all powerful, that has all these things. And yet, we have the world that we have. Like, I've got incurable cancer. Like, it sucks, and we all have to find a way to deal with this. But it's somehow not intellectually satisfying to me to have a God of limited powers. That's sort of the short answer.
Okay, my view, for what little it's worth, is that if there is a God of any kind, limited unlimited, but I would think unlimited is the more logical one, but any kind. And we have the undeniable problem of evil. And I think the animal suffering that Helen has focused on is really important and is underplayed in a world that focuses on human evil, which of course is bad enough. But animal evil throughout hundreds of millions of years in terms of pain is undeniable. That if there is a God at all of any kind, that you would need a life after death, something after death to justify it. And if you didn't have that, it would be logically impossible to justify, no matter how many contortions you bring into your logic. So I want to bring life after death into this conversation. Helen, let's start with you. In your understanding of where you were in Christianity as you've moved on to broader understanding, how does life after death figure into this entire way of thinking?
I, for the longest time, thought that if God's ends are to make something really beautiful and magnificent, and maybe God doesn't care about us, but I don't think that's right. I think God does somehow care about us. Then I've talked to so many philosophers about this recently. They say, yeah, you need actually to make it somehow work. You need life after death. And once you have life after death, then you can have quite some horrors and it's still okay. So there's a beautiful example in Christopher Southgate's book The Groaning of Creation, where he references Romans 8. And in Romans 8 you have like so Paul writes something like that creation is groaning as in childbirth. It's very beautiful imagery. And one example he gives is pelican chicks. So I think it's pelicans, but basically there's a species of bird and they will have one chick that they can raise, but they will sometimes have a second chick. The second chick is not meant to survive. The second chick will eventually just starve in the nest while the other chick sort of pushes it away, etc. But sometimes it's very abundant. The food is enough so that the second chick survives. Also, something sometimes goes wrong with the first chick, and then the second chick can come in. So basically, they sort of overproduce chicks because it's evolutionarily advantageous to have an extra chick. But the downside of that is that you basically have in every clutch of this bird, I think pelicans, that there is a chick that is slowly starving to death, that is opening up its little beak trustingly. The parents ignore it and go to the other. Is that horrific, right? So Southgate says, like, but if there is a heaven where the insurance chick has a good life, then the problem is solved, right? And I think so, like, and I think it's unsurprising. I think that's one of the most beautiful aspects of Christianity that people like Paul have also hammered on. That is that actually it's an audacious hope that you could have an afterlife where all the horrible things sort of get erased, and where tears get dried, and where insurance chicks grow up to be beautiful pelicans and so on.
Okay. Philip?
Yeah, I didn't know that about pelicans. I feel a bit upset now about that story. Yeah, in terms of life after death, so I'm always thinking of myself as the middle way person, and I think if you're a total atheist, then probably life after death is incredibly improbable. Whereas if you're a very traditional theist and there's a loving God who can do anything, well, then probably a life after death is pretty probable. Whereas if you go for a good God of limited powers, then I think it's plausible that God would want to preserve our consciousness after death. What we don't know is whether God's able to do that. But God might be able to do that, might not be, and so it becomes in the territory of a reasonable hope. And as I understand the Christian story, it's that God did find a way of doing that by becoming more similar to us, sharing in our nature so that we can share in God's nature to some extent in this life, and more so in the next life. So that is the Christian hope I put my trust in, but I do take it to be very uncertain. Basically, I wouldn't be surprised if it was true. I wouldn't be surprised if it was false. It's sort of more or less 50-50. Just one more thing on life after death. Most liberal Christians I know, I count myself as a liberal progressive Christian. Most progressive Christians are what we call universalists, that they think everyone's going to be saved in the end. But whereas if God was all powerful, I'd be a universalist. I don't think God wants anyone, but because I think God is limited power, it could be that God's not able to save everyone. Now, I don't think that's going to be because people are not Christians or something. But actually, when we read the New Testament, we find when Jesus is doing incredible things, people have got to be kind of up for it. They've got to have sort of confidence in it. So maybe possibility that if there is a afterlife, maybe to an extent one has to be kind of open to it. Again, to be clear, not by being a Christian, but by somehow being open to the possibility. And maybe some people are just resolutely closed off to that possibility. And I don't think that they're going to be punished in hell forever, but maybe some people will perhaps pass out of existence just because they're resolutely not open to the possibility of an afterlife. One more time, I'm very uncertain of all of this. I hope universalism is true. I hope there's life after death, but I don't think I would want to say that it's not about, oh, that's the point of it. Again, William Lane Craig, I've sometimes heard talk as though this life is just to be thrown away. It's all about the life to come. Whereas I think, hoping in a greater purpose, including a life to come, frees you up to enjoying the present moment. If this life is a bit like childhood, but you want a great childhood, and it frees you up to enjoy that, I think, if you hope in a greater purpose.
So, Helen, where do we go from here? You've rejected Christianity, have moved away from it, and you talk about Spinoza's God or the God of nature, kind of a pantheistic view. You've also talked about Taoism, which actually has some similarities with a pantheistic Spinoza nature point of view. So, where are you now? Where are you going?
So I really like this idea that we are all God in some respects, that sort of like pantheistic or panentheistic. So I definitely lean towards that. And I do like Spinoza's idea of that, God acts completely freely, and that we also act freely. And it doesn't, like, it could still be that all my actions are completely determined by what physically came before, ever since the Big Bang. That's possible. But I can still act freely in the sense that I can have things that come from my views, my well considered views, versus me being coerced, for example, or being persuaded in a way that I don't want. So that's how he brings freedom back into the picture. So I love this idea of just being part of this, well, a full, for Spinoza, it's not so much that you're a part of the world of God, but that you are a full expression of God. So each of us is a finite, but still full, in a way, expression of God, a mode. And I found that very comforting, because I've been very ill. And obviously, then you start asking yourself these questions, right? I mean, in the beginning, even when I got ill, I thought, like, is God punishing me for leaving Christianity? But I quickly pushed the thought away. Like, I thought, if God is like that, I want nothing to do with him. Like, that's not the God that is worthy of worship. I think that it's reasonable for us to try to look at things that resonate with our evidence, but I see evidence as very broad as things in our lives. I love Taoism also, with the idea that you are just basically, and physicists would say that that's right, like you create certain information, like you generate certain actions, and they will never get lost, in a sense. They're always there. Now, is that a comforting sense of immortality? Like, it's not very comforting, is it? That somebody with like a telescope who would look up to us would see me alive, even though it's like 4,000 years in the future, because of the, that sort of thing, right? that basically the information is preserved. So I don't know if it's particularly comforting, but that's certainly a non-trivial way to think that, we are just full aspects of this holy divine reality. And I think it helps also to look at your fellow human beings in that way, and fellow creatures. Like, if we all think of ourselves as so infinitely valuable, and really, really try to think of it that way, it really radically changes how I see other people and how I deal with other people. So I'm pretty happy with how I'm going. I don't know where I'm going to end up.
So, Philip, where do you go from here? Can you make progress with your heretical Christianity? I specifically want to ask you about what Helen was just talking about a pantheistic or a panentheistic view, which you have espoused both with your panpsychism and perhaps now with your heretical Christianity. And panentheism means that everything is in God, but that doesn't exhaust God. God is somehow also outside of that, but everything that does exist exists within God.
Yeah, well, I found what Helen said very beautiful and profound. I'm worried about how to say something equal to it, but yeah, I suppose I am also attracted to some form of panentheism that fits quite well with the panpsychist view I've defended for most of my career. Fits with, I suppose, I think so many people in different religious traditions in different parts of the world have mystical experiences which suggests to them that the divine or something like that pervades the physical universe, is not entirely separate from it. And yeah, and if you're a panpsychist, this is easy to make sense of, I suppose, because if it's easy to make sense of God pervading the universe if it's already filled with consciousness, rather than if the universe is sort of a mechanism and cold, empty space. Then God in the universe seems a little bit like the ghost in the machine or something. So it certainly spiritually resonates with me, makes intellectual sense to me, and ultimately, I think if there is a God, I don't think God's too fussed about what religion we are. I mean, not to say, I mean, the different religions do contradict each other, right? So I'm not saying, oh, they're all true in different ways, but I think it's more important to find a way of expressing yourself spiritually, engaging with the transcendent, um, even if you happen to get the wrong religion. I think it's more important to find a way of finding spiritual fulfillment and relating to the universe and the transcendent and other people. So I guess I've found a way of doing this in something I think is spiritually satisfying, brings me joy, and is probable enough to be worth taking a bet on. But I'm not gonna kind of bully someone if they found another way of doing that, because mostly because these matters are inherently uncertain. And so yeah, it's better than any religion is better than, well, not any religion, let me take that again. uh, so if people find a way of doing that, then I think that's a good thing.
Superficially, Helen, Philip, you seem to be heading in opposite directions, passing in the night, as it were, but I can see that both of you are really heading towards the same goal, and I'd hope I could join you there. So thank you very much. It's been a spectacular conversation, very moving, very poignant, and very deep. And I think there's a lot that people can think about. Viewers can watch over 1,000 videos on philosophy of religion and philosophical theology, and over another 1,000 videos on consciousness, from neurobiology, dualism, panpsychism with Philip, and others, idealism and life after death, cosmic consciousness from other religions, all infused with critical thinking and not coming up with definitive conclusions. I'm sorry. All of this on the Closer to Truth website and Closer to Truth YouTube channel. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Once again, Helen, Philip, our deep appreciation. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a wonderful and enjoyable conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing. Closer to Truth is now accepting your tax-exempt donations. Please come to closertotruth.com/donate. Thank you very much for supporting us, and thanks for watching.